The late afternoon sun melted into gold over the city skyline, casting a warm glow over the modest neighborhood of Willow Creek. Inside a cramped studio apartment tucked between an aging laundromat and a corner grocery, Elena Ramirez stood before a mirror that had seen better days. The edges were chipped, the reflection faintly warped. But tonight she looked at herself as if she were about to face a world that had never seen her before. Her trembling hands smoothed the wrinkles out of a soft blue dress, borrowed from her friend Lucia, the only one who still believed life could surprise her. The dress wasn't new, and neither were the heels she had pulled from the bottom of her closet. But for the first time in months, Elena allowed herself to feel hopeful. For 6 years she had worked as a housemaid in the sprawling glass mansion of Alexander Cole, a man whose name appeared regularly in the business pages, a man whose empire stretched from hotels to private airlines. The Cole estate was a world of gleaming marble, whispered footsteps, and silent wealth. Elena moved through that world unseen, polishing floors that reflected a luxury she could never touch, arranging flowers that would wilt long before she could afford her own bouquet. She had watched Alexander's life from a respectful distance, his calm authority, his quiet routines, the way people around him seemed to hold their breath in his presence. To her he was unreachable, like a constellation she could admire but never name. Yet today it wasn't Alexander's world she was thinking about. It was her own. For weeks she had been chatting online with a man named Ryan. His messages had been kind, his words warm, his compliments carefully chosen. He said he admired humility, simplicity, and realness, things Elena thought she still had despite life's disappointments. When he suggested dinner, she hesitated, afraid her world of second-hand clothes and shared rent couldn't meet his expectations. But he had laughed and said, "It's not about the place, it's about the company." Those words had stayed with her. Now, as she counted the few crumpled bills in her purse, just $8 in total, her confidence wavered. Lucia had insisted, "You have to go, Elena. You've spent your whole life cleaning up other people's dreams. It's time to live your own." Maybe she was right. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe someone would finally see her. When she arrived at the Magnolia Room, a high-end restaurant glowing with chandeliers and soft jazz, her steps faltered. Everything about the place screamed sophistication. The valet reached for her car keys before realizing her car wasn't the kind that belonged there. She forced a small smile, clutching her purse tighter, and walked inside. The hostess, impeccably dressed, smiled a practiced smile. "Good evening, miss. Do you have a reservation?" Yes. I'm meeting someone. His name is Ryan." The hostess checked the list, nodded, and gestured toward a table by the window. Elena followed, heart pounding, aware of the murmurs around her. The quiet appraisals of people who lived in a different world, one she had only ever served. The table was set for two, white linen, polished silver, a single white rose in a glass vase. She sat down carefully, wishing she could blend into the decor. 8 o'clock came, then 8:10, then 8:20. She checked her phone again and again, her heart tightening a little more each time. Finally, at 8:30, her phone buzzed. She opened the message and her world tilted. "Sorry, but I don't think this will work out. You seem sweet, but you're not really my type. Good luck." Her throat closed. She read the message again, slower this time, hoping she had misunderstood. But it was all there. The dismissal, the rejection, the quiet cruelty. Around her, laughter echoed like something from another life. The waiter approached politely and she shook her head, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving." As she stood, she felt the sting of eyes on her. The woman at the next table whispered something to her companion, who chuckled under his breath. Elena's vision blurred. The humiliation burned deeper than she'd expected. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest and hurried toward the door. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that in a corner booth at the far end of the restaurant, Alexander Cole had been watching. He hadn't meant to. He was supposed to be reviewing contracts over a quiet dinner. But something about the young woman by the window had caught his eye. Something in the way she sat up straight despite her nervous hands. Something in the quiet grace she carried even in discomfort. It took him a moment to recognize her. The maid from his home. The woman who moved through his halls each morning before he even came down for breakfast. Elena. He had never truly looked at her before, Not really. She had always been background to his world of meetings, flights, and figures. But seeing her here in that faded blue dress, eyes filled with hope and then heartbreak, it did something to him. It tore through the indifference he'd built like armor around his life. He saw the moment she read the message, saw her shoulders collapse under invisible weight, saw the way she blinked hard, trying not to cry in public, and suddenly he wasn't the billionaire CEO anymore. He was just a man watching another human being suffer. Without thinking, Alexander rose from his seat. He didn't plan the gesture. It wasn't out of pity, but instinct, a quiet impulse to protect, to step into a story that didn't belong to him but felt like it should. As Elena reached the door, he caught up to her. "Elena?" She froze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined his voice. When she turned and saw him standing there, tall, impeccably dressed, and utterly out of place in her world, her first emotion wasn't surprise. It was mortification. "Mr. Cole," she stammered, lowering her eyes. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean I was just leaving." "I know," he said softly. "But please don't, not like this." "Sir, this isn't—" She stopped, words tangled with tears she refused to shed. "It's been a mistake. I shouldn't have come here." "Maybe it wasn't a mistake," he said. His tone was calm but carried a warmth she had never heard before. "Come sit with me. You shouldn't have to leave like this." "Mr. Cole, I can't. People will—" "Let them," he interrupted gently. "Sometimes the world whispers because it doesn't understand what it's seeing." The words stunned her into silence. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she followed him back to his table. The waiter appeared immediately, looking puzzled. Alexander nodded. "We'll dine together." For a long moment, neither spoke. The restaurant hum filled the air, the soft clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversations. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady but kind. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "Someone stood you up." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the napkin. "Yes, but it's fine. It's not the first time life has tried to remind me where I belong." "Where you belong?" he repeated, almost incredulous. "You don't belong to anyone's idea of worth, Elena. Least of all someone who can't see it." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You're kind, Mr. Cole, but you don't understand. People like me, we're invisible until we make mistakes. And tonight I made one. I thought I could fit in." "You did fit in," he said, his voice lower now, something unguarded in it. "In fact, you were the only person I saw here tonight who looked real." Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting his. For a moment, the world shrank to that table. She saw in him not the billionaire who signed her paychecks, but a man who looked tired of perfection, tired of pretending. Something flickered between them, a fragile recognition, like two strangers realizing they had been walking parallel roads all along. When the waiter returned, Alexander ordered without looking at the menu, and when he asked Elena what she'd like, she hesitated. "I don't think I can afford a—" he smiled faintly. "You're my guest, Elena. Tonight there are no prices, just possibilities." Dinner arrived, 2 plates that looked more like art than food, and for the first time that evening, Elena allowed herself to breathe. The conversation flowed awkwardly at first, then gently, like water over smooth stones. He asked her about her family, about her childhood in Santa Fe, about why she came to the city. She told him she had dreamed of becoming a teacher once, but life had other plans. He told her quietly that success had cost him more than he'd expected. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and for the first time in years, Elena felt seen. Not for her uniform or her title, but for her laughter, her courage, the quiet strength that had carried her through endless days. Later that night, as Alexander's driver escorted her home, Elena stared out the window, heart pounding with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. The man who had built empires had seen her fall, and instead of walking away, he had chosen to catch her. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night would not be the end. It would be the first ripple in a storm neither could have imagined, a story of humility and grace colliding with power and guilt, of 2 hearts learning that kindness could build bridges wealth never could. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath years of quiet endurance, Elena felt something awaken. Maybe Lucia was right. Maybe one unexpected evening, one act of compassion could begin to change an entire life. Morning filtered through the tall glass windows of the Cole estate like liquid gold, pouring across marble floors that gleamed with the precision of a world kept spotless by invisible hands. Elena had always arrived before dawn, unseen and unheard, moving through the great halls while the house still slept. Yet today the familiar rhythm of her footsteps felt strange, as if every corner of the mansion whispered about what had happened the night before. She could still feel the warmth of Alexander's words echoing inside her chest, the quiet gentleness of his voice when he'd told her she belonged, the way he had looked at her as if the world had finally stopped spinning for a moment. She wanted to lock those memories away, to treat them as a dream that had escaped her tired imagination. But the truth pressed too vividly against her heart. Something had changed. When she stepped into the grand foyer carrying a basket of fresh linens, she nearly collided with Margaret, the head housekeeper, a stern woman who noticed everything. "You're late," Margaret remarked, her voice clipped but curious. "Unusual for you." Elena lowered her gaze and murmured an apology, but she felt the older woman's eyes lingering on her face, as if she could see the trace of last night's emotion still glowing there. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again," Margaret added, moving on, though her tone carried a shade of something that wasn't quite anger, perhaps suspicion. Upstairs, the morning sun painted the corridors in silver and amber. Elena moved quietly from room to room, folding towels, straightening drapes, dusting surfaces that hardly ever collected dust. But her thoughts kept slipping back to that dinner. The delicate clinking of cutlery, the low hum of his voice when he'd asked about her childhood, the moment he had listened, truly listened, as she described her dreams of becoming a teacher. No one had ever listened like that. Not her former employers, not the world that passed her by every day, and certainly not a man like him. Meanwhile, in his study overlooking the gardens, Alexander Cole sat at his desk, surrounded by files and contracts that suddenly felt meaningless. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper ink, the air still thick with the silence he used to find comforting. But this morning, he couldn't focus. He kept seeing her, the quiet grace with which she had held herself even in humiliation, the way her laughter, once it finally appeared, had softened everything around her. For years he had thought success meant efficiency, control, distance. Yet one evening in her company had unsettled him in ways he couldn't define. His assistant, Daniel, entered with a folder and a cautious expression. "Sir, the shareholders' call is scheduled for 10. Would you like me to prepare the quarterly overview?" Alexander nodded absently. "Yes, go ahead." As Daniel turned to leave, Alexander added, "And Daniel, make sure the staff has the afternoon off tomorrow. They've been working hard." The assistant blinked, surprised by the sudden generosity. "Of course, sir." Left alone again, Alexander leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. The quiet mansion outside his office suddenly felt too large, too lifeless. He thought of Elena polishing these very halls, passing through his life unseen. How many times had she greeted him with a polite smile, while he was too absorbed in a call to notice? How many mornings had she quietly ensured that his world functioned perfectly, never asking for anything in return? He exhaled slowly, realizing that wealth had built him a fortress, and that fortress had kept more than loneliness outside. It had kept humanity outside too. By noon, the mansion was stirring with routine. Elena carried a tray of polished glassware toward the dining room when she heard a voice behind her. "Good morning, Elena." She turned, startled to find Alexander standing there, jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly, a faint smile curving his lips. No one had ever seen him like this. Unhurried, almost casual. She immediately straightened, clutching the tray like armor. "Good morning, sir. I didn't expect you here." "I noticed," he said lightly. "May I?" He gestured to the tray, taking it from her before she could protest. "You shouldn't carry this alone." She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or scold him. "It's my job, Mr. Cole." "Maybe," he replied, setting the tray on the table. "But even jobs deserve moments of kindness." His tone wasn't commanding this time. It was almost searching. "Thank you for dinner last night," he added quietly. Her heart skipped. "Dinner?" she echoed, half whispering. "Yes," he said, "for reminding me that not everything valuable is written on paper or measured in profit." She didn't know how to respond. The walls she'd built between them, the invisible boundaries of class, wealth, propriety, suddenly felt paper thin. But she also knew how fragile her position was. "Sir," she said softly, "I don't want you to think last night was an accident. You were kind, but I don't expect anything more." His gaze held hers, calm but unreadable. Maybe it was an accident, he admitted. But sometimes accidents reveal truths we've been avoiding. Then, before she could answer, he stepped back, his usual composure returning. "Enjoy your day, Elena." And he walked away, leaving her standing there, her pulse racing. That afternoon, as she swept the grand staircase, the other maids whispered nearby. They had noticed the small things, the way Alexander had looked at her, the way he'd asked after her well-being that morning. Rumors travel faster than footsteps in a mansion. She must have done something, one of them murmured. Maybe he's taking pity on her. Elena kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but each word lodged inside her like a tiny stone. Pity. The last thing she wanted was to be pitied. Yet when the day ended and she walked out through the servants' gate, a black sedan was waiting. Daniel stepped out and opened the door. "Miss Ramirez, Mr. Cole asked that we drop you home." "It's late," she hesitated. "That's not necessary, Mahu, please," Daniel interrupted with a polite smile. He insisted. The ride was quiet except for the hum of the engine. Through the tinted window, the city blurred into streaks of amber light and shadow. Elena thought of the distance between her tiny apartment and the mansion she had just left. Not just the physical distance, but the gulf of class, the weight of expectation. She wondered what people would say if they saw her like this, being driven home in her employer's car. She wondered what he was thinking somewhere back in that house of glass. Meanwhile, Alexander stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the night air cool against his face. He had spent years mastering control, negotiating empires, shaping outcomes. Yet for the first time he felt powerless, and not in business but in emotion. There was a quiet ache in him, a pull toward something simple and pure. He thought of Elena's laughter echoing softly across the restaurant table, the courage it had taken for her to face humiliation with grace. He realized that the woman who polished his mirrors had somehow become his reflection, showing him everything he had lost in pursuit of success. Days turned into a week, and though neither spoke much again, a subtle shift had taken root between them. He noticed her more, the way she hummed under her breath while arranging flowers, the way she always paused to check the sunlight on the piano before dusting it. She, in turn, began to see glimpses of the man behind the empire, a quiet sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, a tenderness that peeked through when he smiled at the gardener's children playing by the fountain. Then, one Friday evening, as a summer storm gathered over the horizon, fate offered another turning point. A sudden flash of lightning knocked out power in half the estate. The staff panicked, scrambling for candles, but Elena went straight to the backup generator in the basement. She had watched the maintenance team enough times to know the procedure. Rain hammered against the walls and thunder growled above as she fought with the switchboard, her clothes damp from the leaking pipes. When the lights flickered back to life, she turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway soaked from the rain, staring at her with something close to astonishment. "You fixed it," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and admiration. She brushed a wet strand of hair from her face. "Someone had to." He laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "You never cease to surprise me," she smiled faintly. "I could say the same." They stood there for a long moment, the air humming with something unsaid. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving the scent of rain and earth in its wake. In that quiet basement, surrounded by humming machinery and the faint glow of emergency lights, two people from opposite worlds stood as equals. No titles, no wealth, no roles. Just two souls who, for once, understood each other completely. When Elena finally turned to leave, Alexander stopped her. "You once said you wanted to be a teacher," he said softly. "If you had the chance to study again, would you take it?" She blinked, unsure whether he was serious. I don't know. Life doesn't usually hand me chances." "Maybe it should," he replied, "and maybe it just did." That night, as she lay awake in her small apartment listening to the distant echo of thunder, Elena realized that something was shifting far beyond her control. It wasn't love, not yet. It was recognition. The recognition of two lonely hearts daring to believe that kindness could bridge even the tallest walls. And in the silence that followed, she whispered to herself, "Maybe the storm wasn't meant to break me. Maybe it came to clear the path ahead." The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm that neither Elena nor Alexander could entirely understand. The mansion remained its usual picture of quiet perfection, its polished floors, whispering halls, and soft-spoken staff. But beneath the stillness something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. Every morning as Elena carried out her chores, she could feel his presence before she even saw him. It wasn't that he watched her openly. It was more like the house itself had changed its gravity, bending slightly toward her. The air felt charged, as if every sound, every footstep, every faint brush of fabric carried meaning now. She tried to tell herself it was imagination, that what had happened in the restaurant and in that storm-lit basement was only an accident of circumstance. But her heart knew otherwise. Some invisible line had been crossed, and the world she had once known no longer fit her the same way. One morning, as she arranged fresh lilies in the drawing room, Alexander entered quietly. He wasn't in his tailored suit today. Instead, he wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and no tie, which was rare enough to make her look up in surprise. "Good morning, Elena," he said, and his tone carried that calm warmth she had come to associate with him when they were alone. "Good morning, sir," she replied, lowering her gaze, yet her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the vase. He walked closer, pausing to admire the flowers. "You have a way of making this place feel alive," he said. "Most people just decorate spaces. You give them spirit." She smiled faintly but didn't look up. "That's kind of you to say. I suppose it's easier to care for beauty when you don't have much of it in your own life." He frowned at that. "You think beauty belongs only to money?" "Not money," she said softly, "but opportunity. Beauty takes time, and time is expensive for people like me." He studied her for a long moment, and then without a word he placed an envelope on the table beside the vase. "What's this?" she asked, confused. "Something overdue," he said simply. Inside, she found a letter, an official one, addressed from the City College of Los Angeles. Her name was printed neatly at the top. It was an admission confirmation with a scholarship notice attached. "I can't accept this," she said instantly, the color draining from her face. "Mr. Cole, I don't. This must be a mistake." "It isn't," he replied calmly. "You said once that life doesn't hand you chances. Maybe it should. So I'm handing you one. You've worked in this house for years, Elena, and you've given it more care than anyone realizes. Consider this not charity but balance." Her breath caught. "You did this? Why?" "Because you once said you wanted to teach," he said, his eyes steady. "And because I know what it feels like to forget your own dreams." She stood there frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. Gratitude and fear tangled inside her like threads pulled in opposite directions. "Sir, people will talk," she whispered. "They already do." "Let them," he said softly, echoing the words he had used the night they first shared dinner. "They only talk because they don't understand the language of kindness." But kindness was rarely simple. Within days, whispers began weaving through the mansion like smoke, quiet at first, then sharper, meaner. The maids spoke in hushed voices when she entered the laundry room. The butler avoided her eyes. Margaret's disapproval became almost palpable. "Whatever this is," she said coldly one evening, "you'd do well to remember your place, Elena. Men like him don't save girls like us. They save themselves." Elena had no reply. She wanted to believe Alexander's gesture came from a place of respect, not pity or guilt. But doubt is a cruel companion. It plants roots in even the bravest hearts. Each time she caught his gaze across the room, she felt the weight of both gratitude and fear pressing against her ribs. For Alexander, the situation wasn't any easier. The board meetings that used to consume his thoughts now felt like noise. The numbers on spreadsheets blurred together. His friends and colleagues noticed his distraction. "You've been different lately," one of them remarked during a charity gala. "You should be careful. People notice when the mighty start looking at the ground." Alexander had smiled politely, but his chest had tightened. They didn't understand. They couldn't. He wasn't falling into recklessness. He was waking from numbness. For years, his life had been a parade of success. Partnerships, awards, power. But none of it had ever filled the quiet space inside him. It took a woman who earned less in a month than he spent on lunch to remind him what it meant to feel human, and yet he was cautious. He didn't want to taint her with rumor or burden her with his attention. So he kept his distance publicly but quietly continued to ensure her path was clear, arranging evening classes that fit her schedule, ensuring her pay continued while she studied, even having Daniel drive her safely home after late lectures. Months passed, and Elena began her classes. The first day she stepped into the college, surrounded by students half her age, her stomach churned with nerves. But as she opened her notebook and heard the professor speak about the power of education to shape lives, she felt something inside her rekindle. She had always believed knowledge was the one form of wealth that no one could take from you. Now she was proving it true. Every evening after class, she would come home exhausted, but alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Sometimes she would find small signs of encouragement waiting for her at work. A new set of books left anonymously in her locker. A note that simply read, "Keep going. The world needs what you have to give." She never asked who left them, she already knew. But one evening everything changed. A tabloid journalist, desperate for scandal, had overheard a gossiping staff member and twisted the story into something poisonous. The next morning's paper carried a headline that made Elena's stomach drop. "Billionaire patron sponsors housemaid secret education, affair or altruism." The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, photographers gathered at the mansion gates, and the staff whispered more loudly than ever. Alexander stormed into his office, fury burning in his chest. "Find out who leaked this," he told Daniel, his voice calm but dangerous. "And make sure the paper issues a correction." "But sir," Daniel said carefully, "even if they retract it, the damage is done. People believe what they want to believe." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then we'll show them the truth." Meanwhile, Elena sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the newspaper spread across her table. Shame and gratitude warred inside her. She had wanted to earn respect through her own efforts, not through anyone's pity or wealth. Now the world had reduced her to a rumor. Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot and relentless. She didn't want to see him. She didn't want to explain. But that evening, as rain began to fall again outside her window, a familiar car stopped in front of her building. She opened the door to find Alexander standing there, rain dripping from his hair, eyes dark with frustration and sorrow. "Elena, I'm so sorry," he said. "I didn't want this, I only wanted to help." She shook her head, stepping back. "Help me? You've turned me into a headline, Mr. Cole, into a spectacle." "That wasn't my doing." "No," she said bitterly, "but it was your world's doing. I don't belong in it. I never will." He took a slow breath, his voice trembling with honesty. "Maybe you don't belong in my world, Elena. Maybe I don't either. But I can't stand by and watch it crush you." Something in his tone broke her anger. She looked up, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Why me, Alexander? Why care so much?" He stepped closer, his voice soft but raw. "Because you remind me of who I was before all this, before the money, before the walls. You remind me that I'm still capable of feeling something real." For a long moment they stood there in the rain, the city noise fading into the distance. She wanted to tell him that his kindness frightened her, that she wasn't ready to trust it. But all she could whisper was, "I don't know what to do." He smiled sadly. "Then don't decide tonight, just keep walking forward. Finish what you started, let them talk, let them doubt. The world has always misunderstood the people who change it." He left without waiting for an answer, disappearing into the rain. When the door closed, Elena pressed her forehead against it, her tears mingling with the rainwater that had followed him inside. For the first time, she understood that kindness could be both a gift and a burden, that sometimes the path to dignity demanded not gratitude, but courage. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet resolve began to form. She would not let scandal or shame steal the chance she had been given. If the world wanted a story, she would write her own. One where a maid became a teacher, not through luck or pity, but through resilience, faith, and the belief that even broken beginnings could lead to beautiful endings. The days that followed the scandal moved like thick, uneasy smoke through the corridors of the Cole estate. The mansion that had once echoed with quiet discipline now carried a pulse of tension that could be felt in every conversation, abruptly silenced when footsteps approached. In every nervous glance exchanged between staff, the glossy perfection of that place had cracked, revealing something raw beneath it, a discomfort that no amount of polish could disguise. The story in the papers had turned Elena's world inside out. Strangers she had never met whispered her name as though it belonged to gossip, not to a living person. The staff who had once worked beside her now treated her with cautious distance, as if she carried some contagious notoriety. Even in the city, when she attended her evening classes, she could feel curious eyes follow her, wondering if the rumors were true. It was astonishing how quickly kindness could be twisted into scandal, how easily the world confused compassion with corruption. For a woman who had spent her life invisible, being suddenly seen was not liberation, it was exposure. Alexander faced a different kind of scrutiny. The media adored the scent of scandal more than the truth. They hounded him with questions about impropriety, about favoritism, about the woman from the servants' quarters who had somehow become the symbol of a billionaire's alleged indiscretion. His board members were uneasy. His advisors insistent that he manage the narrative, that he quietly distance himself until the noise died down. But Alexander had built his empire on silence and control for too long. This time he refused to hide behind statements drafted by lawyers. When a journalist shouted across a conference floor asking if the rumors were true, Alexander's calm reply stunned everyone. "The truth," he said, "is that kindness should never need to be defended." The room fell silent, cameras flashing, pens frozen above notepads. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only one he would give. Meanwhile, Elena decided that she would not run away, not this time. Every instinct screamed at her to quit, to retreat back into anonymity. But she knew that leaving would only make the story feel justified. So she kept working. She showed up each morning, head held high, doing her duties with the same quiet dignity she always had. When she passed through the halls, the whispers followed, but she no longer flinched from them. Something inside her had hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. It was as if life itself were testing her to see how much she truly believed in her own worth. One late afternoon, as the sun bled orange through the tall windows of the library, Alexander entered while she was dusting the shelves. He paused by the doorway, watching her move with unhurried grace, the same way she had on the very first day he had noticed her. The faint scent of old books filled the air, mingling with the lavender polish she always used. "You shouldn't still be here," he said quietly. "You've been working since dawn." She turned, a gentle defiance in her expression. "I said I wouldn't run," she replied. "If I leave, they win, and I've spent my whole life letting other people's opinions decide who I'm allowed to be." He smiled faintly, admiration flickering through his exhaustion. "Then let me at least help you carry the weight." He reached for the stack of books she was arranging and began placing them on the shelves beside her. For a few minutes they worked in silence, side by side, the tension between them no longer sharp but quietly protective, like a flame guarded by glass. When they finished, he sat in one of the leather chairs, studying her face. "Elena," he said after a long pause, "I've spent years building things that look strong on the outside and hollow on the inside. For the first time, I'm proud of something real. And it has nothing to do with business. It has to do with the fact that you refuse to let cruelty define you." She felt her throat tighten. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," he answered softly. "Just keep proving them wrong." That evening, she returned to her apartment and found an envelope slipped beneath the door. Inside was a letter from the college dean, informing her that she had been chosen to speak at an upcoming community event, an open forum on the power of perseverance. Someone, likely Alexander, had recommended her. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She had never spoken publicly in her life. She had always been the quiet one in the background, the one who blended in. Now she was being asked to stand in front of strangers and talk about hope. For 2 nights she barely slept, rehearsing words in her head, fearing she would fail him, fail herself. When the day arrived, the auditorium was full. Students, reporters, curious members of the public. Elena stood backstage clutching her notes, hands trembling. Through the curtain she saw Alexander seated near the back, discreet, almost hidden, yet unmistakably present. Their eyes met for an instant, and in that single look he seemed to tell her everything she needed to know. "You're ready." She walked onto the stage, the murmur of the crowd fading as she reached the podium. Her voice wavered at first, but then steadied. "For most of my life," she began, "I believed value was something the world gave you through money, titles, approval. I was wrong. Value is what you give yourself when you decide that your story isn't over, just because someone else says it is." The room fell silent, except for the soft creak of chairs. "I've been humiliated, doubted, and judged," she continued. "But I've also learned that no one can humiliate you unless you agree to feel small. We can't control what others whisper. We can only control what we choose to become louder than their voices." When she finished, the applause came slowly at first, then built into something thunderous. Elena blinked against tears she hadn't realized were falling. Somewhere in the crowd she saw Alexander rise to his feet, not as a billionaire applauding a cause, but as a man honoring courage. For a brief moment she felt her world expand far beyond the mansion, the rumors, the limitations of her past. She had found her own voice, and it echoed louder than the scandal ever could. After the event, Alexander waited until the crowd thinned before approaching her. "You were extraordinary," he said. "You reminded them and me that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to bend." She smiled, exhaustion and relief softening her features. "Maybe now they'll stop talking," she said. "No," he replied gently. "People will always talk. But from today, they'll talk about your courage, not your shame." The following weeks brought unexpected changes. The college invited her to assist with literacy programs for underprivileged youth. News outlets that had once printed her name in scandal now asked to interview her about resilience. Slowly, public perception began to shift. Alexander's company issued a scholarship fund in her name, the Ramirez Initiative for Education, and the world for once saw an act of compassion without cynicism. But inside the mansion, things were changing in quieter ways. Margaret, who had once eyed Elena with suspicion, approached her one morning as she polished the staircase. "You handled it better than I expected," she admitted. "Perhaps I misjudged you." Elena smiled softly. "We've all been misjudged at some point. Maybe that's why forgiveness feels so heavy. It's the only way to set it down." As summer turned to autumn, the scandal faded into history, replaced by something brighter. Alexander and Elena's paths continued to cross, sometimes in professional necessity, sometimes by quiet intention. There was no declaration, no confession, just a deepening understanding that what had begun as an act of kindness had evolved into a companionship built on respect, shared solitude, and unspoken trust. At night, when Alexander stood by the terrace looking over the city lights, he often thought about the strange ways fate brings people together, not through grandeur, but through grace. He had once believed wealth insulated him from life's chaos. Now he knew it had only kept him from seeing its beauty. Elena, on the other hand, no longer measured her days by survival. Her evenings were filled with lesson plans and laughter from the children she tutored, and every sunrise felt like an invitation to keep growing. Sometimes she still felt the old ache of fear, the residue of shame that public judgment leaves behind. But it no longer ruled her.
Instead, it reminded her of how far she had come.
She had been broken open by cruelty, and through that fracture, light had entered. And in the quiet corners of both their lives, a question lingered, tender and unspoken. What happens when gratitude deepens into something neither expected but both understood? For now, neither dared answer it. They simply let the world move forward, carrying between them a story no headline could ever define. A story not about scandal or wealth, but about two souls who discovered that dignity and compassion are worth more than anything money can buy. Winter arrived quietly that year, as if the world itself wanted to exhale after months of noise and turmoil. The city glittered under pale skies, the air scented faintly with rain and chimney smoke, and the coal estate stood calm again, its marble floors polished, its gardens bare but serene, its silence no longer heavy with tension. Inside those walls, everything seemed the same. The ticking of distant clocks, the steady rhythm of footsteps across long corridors, the faint echo of life continuing. Yet beneath that stillness, everything had changed. Elena had finished her first term at college with honors. The scholarship fund that bore her name had already helped dozens of young students begin their own journeys. The same world that had once judged her now applauded her perseverance, but she carried that new admiration with quiet humility. She still rose early, still worked part-time at the estate, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She told herself she was simply returning the loyalty of those who had stood by her. But somewhere deep inside, she knew she stayed for one reason. Alexander, he too, had changed in ways the outside world could never have measured. The man who had once lived by schedules and markets now found time to walk through the gardens after dawn, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cold air that smelled faintly of cedar and earth. He had begun meeting with the scholarship recipients personally, listening to their dreams, learning their stories. His board members called it a softer image, but to Alexander it was something deeper, a reclaiming of the humanity he had nearly traded away for ambition. He watched Elena move through his house with quiet purpose, no longer the shy maid who kept to corners, but a woman who belonged anywhere she chose to stand. And yet, even as pride swelled in him, he carried a weight he never spoke of, the knowledge that soon he would have to let her go. He had seen what public attention did to her once, and he refused to be the shadow that followed her forever. She deserved to build her own legacy, unanchored by his name or protection. One evening, snow began to fall, a rare softness over Los Angeles, the flakes melting the instant they touched the warm pavement. Elena was working late in the library, preparing notes for a literacy workshop she would soon lead at a local community center. Stacks of worn books surrounded her, the lamplight turning her hair into threads of bronze. When Alexander entered quietly, she looked up and smiled, a real effortless smile that made something inside him ache with both joy and dread. "You're still awake," he said. "So are you," she replied, gesturing toward the papers in his hand. He set them aside and walked to the window, watching the thin snow dissolve against the glass. "I've decided to step down from the company," he said finally. She froze, not sure she'd heard right. "What? Why?" He turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "It's time. I've built enough. I want to live differently now, to do something that matters beyond profit. There's a foundation forming around the scholarship program. I want to expand it, schools, training centers, outreach programs, and I want you to lead it." The room seemed to blur around her. "Me?" she whispered. "I don't know how to run something like that." He smiled faintly. "You didn't know how to face a crowd either, remember? And you did it with grace. You'll learn. You always do." Her heart pounded. The offer was more than an opportunity. It was trust, freedom, and faith all in one breath. But there was fear too. "If I say yes," she asked quietly, "what happens to us?" Alexander hesitated, and in that pause she read everything he couldn't say. "There is no us that the world would allow," he said softly. "Not yet. If we stay in the same story, they'll rewrite it until it breaks us both. But if you walk forward, if you build something independent of me, the world will have to respect you on your own terms." His voice trembled, just enough for her to feel the cost behind the words. He was offering her the very thing that would take her away from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the snow had turned to rain again, streaking the glass with silver trails. Elena rose from her chair and stood beside him, close enough that their reflections merged in the window. "You once told me," she said quietly, "that kindness shouldn't have to be defended. Maybe love shouldn't have to hide either." He looked at her then, truly looked, as though memorizing the shape of her face, the steadiness of her eyes, the quiet power that had grown in her since that night in the restaurant. "Elena," he murmured, "if there's one thing I've learned from you, it's that love isn't proven by possession. It's proven by the willingness to see someone free." She swallowed hard, her vision blurring. "And if I don't want to be free?" He smiled sadly. "Then make freedom your choice, not your cage." There was nothing left to say. He reached out, brushed a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand, and whispered, "Go build what you were meant to build. When you stand on that stage one day as a teacher, a leader, look for me in the crowd. I'll be the one still clapping." Weeks turned into months. Elena accepted the position and threw herself into the work. She traveled across the city, meeting with schools in struggling neighborhoods, setting up classes for adults who had never learned to read, creating programs that taught not just words but dignity. The Ramirez Foundation grew faster than anyone expected, its mission simple but powerful: to give those who had been overlooked a voice. Every success carried his unseen fingerprints, the guidance he had offered, the courage he had ignited. But she built it with her own strength, her own name. She rarely saw Alexander now. He had quietly moved abroad to oversee new projects and to let distance protect them both from speculation. Sometimes, when her work grew overwhelming, she would find herself glancing toward the sky at dusk, wondering if somewhere far away he was doing the same. Years passed, and the world forgot the scandal that had once nearly broken her. New stories filled the headlines, new names took the stage. But in a modest school on the edge of the city, Elena stood before a classroom of children, her voice firm yet gentle, her eyes bright with purpose. Behind her on the chalkboard were the words she had written herself. Education is the quiet revolution. Every time she repeated that line, she felt his voice somewhere behind it, the echo of the man who had seen her when no one else did. One spring morning, the foundation organized its first international summit, bringing educators from across the country to celebrate its success. Elena, now a recognized figure in educational reform, was to deliver the keynote address. As she stepped onto the stage, she felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt years earlier before her first speech. The hall was vast, filled with people from every walk of life. She took a deep breath, scanning the faces, and then at the back of the room she saw him. Older now, silver touching his hair, but unmistakably Alexander. He stood quietly, hands clasped, watching her with the same look of quiet pride that had changed her life all those years ago. The sight almost undid her, but she steadied herself, smiling softly before she began. She spoke not of wealth or loss, but of the power of one act of compassion, of how a single evening and a $5 dream had altered the course of 2 lives. Her words wove through the audience like light, reminding them that change often begins not with grand gestures, but with simple human decency. When she finished, the applause was overwhelming, but all she saw was him, standing there, clapping slowly, eyes shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. After the crowd dispersed, she found him waiting in the hallway, a small bouquet of white lilies in his hand. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "So did you," he replied. They stood there in the quiet, years of distance folding into a single moment. He handed her the flowers, their scent fresh and familiar, and she realized she was no longer the maid who had once feared to dream. She was the woman who had built her own future, and he was the man who had learned that letting go can sometimes be the truest form of love. Later, as the evening sky blushed into gold and the city hummed below them, Elena walked out onto the balcony overlooking the gardens of the Foundation's new headquarters. The air carried the scent of jasmine and new beginnings. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the world she had helped shape. The pain, the humiliation, the doubt, all of it had become the soil from which her purpose had grown. And somewhere deep in that quiet, she heard the echo of that first night, the clinking of glasses, the trembling hope of a young woman with only $5 in her purse, and the voice of a man who had said, "Let them talk." She smiled. They had talked. They had doubted. And still she had risen. The story that began in humiliation had ended in grace, not the kind the world gives, but the kind one builds within. It was the story of a maid and a millionaire, yes, but more than that, it was the story of how one act of kindness can light a fire that no rumor, no judgment, no fear can ever extinguish. And as the last light of evening spilled across the glass walls, reflecting both sky and city in equal measure, Elena whispered into the wind, "Thank you, Alexander." Somewhere she knew he was smiling because in the end, both of them had learned that love, when it is pure, doesn't always ask to be owned. Sometimes it simply asks to be remembered.